Thank you. So the title of my presentation is not Your Money or Your Life, but Your Planet or Your Career. And you will soon understand why I chose this title. I wanted to start with a few figures. For universities, air travel emissions are often a significant part of their total institutional emissions. And I found a few examples that are really striking. For example, the University of British Columbia, in there it was estimated that 68% of the annual emissions of this university are due to air travel emissions. Another striking example is that the business-related air travel emissions of the Department of Geography of this university are 30 times that of its building for the heating and the electricity. So it's really a huge problem. Another example is in Switzerland at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH Zurich, where 50% of the emissions are related to air travel. Yet another example, again in Switzerland, it's at the EPFL in Lausanne, where business air travel produces 1/3 of the total emissions. And ULB, as it was already said, is currently calculating or estimating its carbon footprint, but it's particularly difficult for our university to track the air travel emissions because the travel booking is highly decentralized. So each researcher, or most researchers, book their flights themselves. And also at the individual level, air travel emissions are often a significant part of a researcher's professional carbon footprint. And I took here the example of one of the professors who published this paper 6 years ago. He tried to estimate the carbon footprint of his PhD thesis. And the result of his calculation was that the PhD project, so during something like 4 years in Belgium, was actually 21 ton of CO2 equivalent. It's about 2 years of a normal individual person living in Belgium. So it's really a lot. So the conclusion of those few figures is that it seems to be very difficult to reduce institutional carbon emission without reducing air travel emissions. But this seems to pose a dilemma, both at the institutional and at the individual level. At both levels, the commitment to reduce air travel emission is sometimes perceived to be in contradiction with other objectives, such as research quality, productivity, impact, or visibility. At the institutional level, it may also be perceived, or it is, coming into conflict with strategic objectives such as internationalization, prestige, excellence, and so on. I will concentrate more on the individual level, on each researcher individual level, where the dilemma is sometimes perceived as the following. The necessity to reduce air travel emissions may interfere or may be considered to interfere with career progression in a context of fierce international competition for permanent positions. So the question that I will try to address here is this dilemma, this tension. Is it more of a perception or more of a reality? So it's actually a very tricky question, I realized, by reading and by thinking about that over the past few days. Because I think that it touches upon many fundamental issues, like what is good science? What makes a good researcher? How do you evaluate science? How do you assess a researcher? Is mobility necessary to produce good science? So those are really difficult questions to tackle. For example, with regard to the last question here, the correlation between mobility, productivity, and success is highly disputed in the literature. But this study, like Sugimoto et al. 2017, found that mobile scholars, which means those who change affiliations, have 40% higher citation rates than non-mobile scholars. But then, is it because their research is better, or is it because their research is more known, or because they know more people, and then exchange citations? And is citation rate a meaningful indicator of good research in the first place? So I think that's really an important question. So obviously, I can't address all those questions, but for some answers, I refer to a few websites, including the slow science and the excellence movements that are very productive in Belgium. But I will try to reflect and give a few insights on so my first question, is this dilemma more of a perception or a reality? And I think that this study that was published 2 months ago is a good starting point to reflect on that question. This paper attracted a lot of attention and was featured in several journals, including in Nature Climate Change last month. So those researchers, they used a database of professional air travel at the University of British Columbia to test whether air travel is linked to scientific productivity and success. And they measured that by using total citations and age index that they also adjusted for academic age. They are, and they say it in the paper that they are well aware of the weaknesses of these measures, but they nonetheless choose these measures because they are frequently used in hiring and grant funding decisions. So, some of their findings. Emission from air travel, distance and number of flights taken were unrelated to scientific production and success. So, this is a very interesting finding, of course, because even when considering scientific production and success in a very narrow sense, as measured as total citation and age index, air travel is not associated with scientific productivity and success. And my guess is that it's even less associated with other aspects of scientific productivity and success, such as quality of teaching, engagement with society, grant funding, quality of PhD supervision, etc. They also deliver other important findings, I think. Like, there is no association, or there was no association in their data sets between air travel and collaboration with other academics. Academics who are further in their career take far more trips and are responsible for far greater emissions than their junior colleagues. And in their data set, they found that full professors are responsible for 3 times more flight emissions than graduate students and postdocs. They also found that something like 26% of the air trip could be considered as avoidable because they were either same-day returns, or they were flight over a short distance, or they were flight over a long distance but with just one night spent. There is also another important finding. I think it's that the academic unit, academic department, had a significant influence on emissions, even when controlling for salary and position, which suggests that departments have different cultures, like internal cultures, or research needs. I will skip those slides because otherwise it will be a bit too long. So this dilemma, is it more of a perception or a reality? Well, it's probably difficult to give a definitive answer, especially in 10 minutes, but I think that even if this tension is more of a perception than a reality, it's still a big deal. Why? First, because it may be detrimental to researcher well-being, because researchers are stuck or perceive that they are stuck in an impossible choice to make between the reduction of their air travel emission and the production of impactful research or their career progression. It may also stand in the way of researchers' willingness to engage in less carbon-intensive travel practices, because such practices are, or researchers perceive them to be, incompatible with scientific production and success. So, I think that universities and research funding agencies have an important role to play in addressing and solving this dilemma, be it perceived or actual, and I give here a few preliminary ideas to do that. I think that career appraisal and career advancement system could give equal importance to short and long distance mobility. I think that they should consider mobility in a broader view, not only geographic mobility, and that's a recommendation of the European Charter for Researchers, the Code of Conduct for the Recruitment of Researchers of the European Commission. It's a very important document that has been endorsed by, by more than 1,000 universities in Europe, including the ULB and the Belgian Fund for Scientific Research. So not only concentrate on geographic mobility, but also on intersectoral, inter-transdisciplinary, and virtual mobility, for example. I think also that it's important to give less importance to geographic mobility as such, because it's an input, but to pay more attention to the outputs of mobility, such as proved collaboration, functioning networks, etc. Why? Because if geographic mobility is valued for itself, you don't make the difference between successful mobility, which demands great skills and implication from the researcher, and unsuccessful mobility, just being like abroad. This could make it possible for researchers to obtain similar outputs, but with all the kinds of mobility that generate less greenhouse gas emissions, and that are also potentially less generator of gender inequalities, work-life imbalances, etc. Universities and research funding agencies could also probably question and rationalize the many travel grants that they offer. They should promote and support all the forms of international collaboration and mobility. I think that now we have the technology to really unleash the potential of virtual collaboration. At the individual level now, well, as it was already said before, when choosing to travel to a conference, a guest lecture, field trip, etc., the environmental impact of flying should be a factor to consider, among many others. And there is, for example, this decision tree that was produced by the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research in 2015, that shows like a bit of the decisions that you could take to support a choice that give importance to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I think also that at the individual level, you could or we should engage in other forms of international collaboration. And I think that it's probably also crucial for senior researchers to do all of the above to lead by example. So that was just a few remarks that I wanted to make.